Today on Unforgettable Love Stories, we meet Charlotte, a woman whose life changed forever after what she describes as the most electrifying and forbidden moment she never imagined living. Are you there, Charlotte? We're eager to hear your story.
Here's Charlotte. It all started on a quiet morning while my husband was away on another business trip. The house felt like any other day, but what I didn't know was that this calm would be the beginning of something that would change my life forever. I never thought that moving in with my new husband, Daniel, and his son, James, would turn into something more complicated than just blending our lives. Marrying Daniel was one of the best choices I'd ever made, but it came with changes I didn't expect. James had just turned 22, and after finishing school, he was still figuring out his next steps in life. With Daniel away on frequent business trips, I ended up spending a lot of time alone with my stepson. At first, it was comfortable between us, maybe a little too comfortable. We got along well, and it was easy to be around him. James was mature, thoughtful, and much older than his age in how he acted. There wasn't any tension between us, so I assumed this was just his considerate personality. But as time passed, there were small moments, things I couldn't ignore, that made me wonder if there was something more. Something neither of us was ready to admit. Everything changed one morning. Daniel was away on a work trip, and I was preparing for a quiet day at home. I was in the bathroom, finishing my morning routine, the sound of the shower still lingering in the air and steam curling along the mirrors. My mind wandered back to a conversation I'd had with James the night before. It was innocent, about his future and his plans, but there was a look in his eyes that I couldn't forget. As I stood at the sink drying my hair, I heard a knock on the bathroom door. James's voice came through softly. "You in there?" I blinked in surprise. James usually didn't knock on the bathroom door, especially this early in the morning. I looked at myself in the mirror, hesitated, and then turned toward the door. "Yeah, James, I'm here. What's up?" There was a brief pause, and I heard him shift on the other side of the door. "Sorry to bother you, but I need to grab something from the bathroom. Do you mind if I come in for a second?" I hesitated, the steam still clinging to the air around me. I was wrapped in a thin towel, my hair damp from the shower, but James's voice sounded normal enough, and it wasn't unusual for him to need something quickly. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and James stepped inside. He was wearing sweats, his hair messy like he had just woken up. He glanced at me briefly, then turned to the cabinet, rummaging through it to find whatever he needed. I turned back to the mirror, pretending to focus on drying my hair. But as I stood there, I felt something shift in the air between us. It was subtle, but undeniable. The way he moved, the way his eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long before he looked away. It was enough to make my heart race. "Got it," he said quietly, holding up a bottle of aspirin. But instead of leaving, he stayed where he was, his gaze flicking back to me. "You, getting ready for something?" he asked. "No, just starting my day," I replied, glancing over at him and trying to act like nothing was unusual. "Why?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter, the tension in the room growing with every second. "I don't know. You look different." His comment caught me off guard. "Different?" I turned to face him fully, my towel still wrapped around me. I met his gaze, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a look of intensity and curiosity that made my breath catch. "Different how?" I asked, my voice softer than I meant it to be. James swallowed, glancing away for a moment before looking back at me. "I don't know. It's hard to explain." I stood there, unsure of what to say, the silence between us growing heavier. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken that I didn't know how to handle. This was James, my stepson. I shouldn't feel this way. Shouldn't be standing here, caught between wanting to ignore the moment and acknowledging what was happening. Before I could speak, James stepped closer, closing the space between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him, unsure of what he was going to do. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm sorry if this is weird," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I've been feeling something lately, and I don't know if it's just me." My breath hitched. I didn't know what to say or how to respond. The truth was, I had felt it too. that subtle shift in our relationship, the way we seemed to be growing closer in ways that weren't purely familial. "James," I started, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what this is, but..." Before I could finish, he stepped even closer. His hand gently brushed against my arm. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. It was exciting, leaving me breathless. I looked up at him, my heart racing, and in that moment I knew we had crossed a line. One that neither of us had planned for, but one that had been building for some time. "I know this is wrong," James whispered, his hand lingering on my arm, "but I can't help how I feel." I couldn't speak. The weight of the moment was overwhelming, and all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't process. This was my stepson, David's son, but the connection between us, the pull I felt toward him, was undeniable. I need to go," I said suddenly, stepping back and breaking the contact between us. My voice was shaky, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. James nodded, his expression pained. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I interrupted, trying to steady myself. We'll talk later." Without waiting for a response, I slipped past him and hurried out of the bathroom. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and something else I wasn't ready to admit. As I closed the door to my bedroom behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? And more importantly, what was I going to do now?
After everything that happened, how do you feel looking back? Do you really think it was a mistake? Or is there something more?
It's complicated. I feel trapped between guilt and a curiosity I can't shake off. Something tells me there's a connection that can't be ignored, even though my mind screams it's a mistake. Sometimes I find myself wondering if it really was a mistake, or if I simply didn't understand what was happening between us. I knew nothing tangible had happened, not yet, but my mind was in a blur, uncertain of what to do next. I spent the rest of the day trying to act like nothing had occurred. I busied myself with household chores, ran errands, anything to keep my mind off the encounter in the bathroom. But no matter how much I distracted myself, I couldn't shake the memory of James standing so close to me, the way his touch had made me feel, or the look in his eyes, one I had never seen before. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I had married Daniel, and James was his son, my stepson. Our relationship was supposed to be simple, familial, but somewhere along the way things had shifted, and I hadn't even noticed until now. I was alone in the house for most of the day. Daniel was away on one of his usual business trips, and James had left shortly after our encounter, leaving me with my thoughts. The quiet of the house felt oppressive, pressing down on me, forcing me to confront what had happened. I found myself replaying the moment in my head over and over. How close we had been, how his words had made my heart race, and how I'd felt that same undeniable pull toward him. By evening, the tension in my chest had only grown worse. I hadn't heard from James all day, and part of me was relieved. I wasn't sure how I'd face him after what had happened, but another part of me, the part I was trying to ignore, missed him. I couldn't stop wondering where he was, what he was thinking, and whether he felt the same confusion I did. I was sitting on the couch, a half-empty glass of wine in my hand, when I heard the front door open. My heart leapt into my throat, and I quickly set the glass down, trying to steady myself. James walked into the living room a few moments later, his expression unreadable. He glanced at me, and for a moment we just stared at each other in silence. The tension between us was thick and palpable. "Hey," he said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, tentative, as if he wasn't sure how to approach me. "Hey," I replied, my voice shaky. I stood up suddenly, feeling self-conscious. I didn't know if you were coming back tonight." "Yeah, I just needed some air," he said, his eyes flicking toward the window. He looked nervous, like he wasn't sure what to say, but there was something else in his expression too, something that mirrored the way I felt. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This was my chance to say something, to clear the air between us, to put everything back to normal. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at him, the way his shirt clung to his chest, the way his dark hair fell slightly into his eyes. He wasn't the boy I had met when I married Daniel. He had grown into a man, and standing here in the quiet of the living room, it was impossible to ignore. James took a step toward me, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. "About earlier, I'm really sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know what came over me." I shook my head, taking a deep breath. "It's okay," I said, though my voice betrayed the fact that I was anything but okay. "I wasn't expecting, well, any of that." He nodded, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "I just feel like, I don't know, like there's something between us. And I know it's wrong, believe me, I know it is. But I can't help it." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, to stop this before it went any further. But the truth was, I couldn't deny what he was saying. There was something between us, something that had been growing for a while now, and I had been too afraid to acknowledge it. "James," I started, my voice trembling. "We can't. This can't happen. You're Daniel's son, and I know," he interrupted, his voice pained. "I know all of that, but that doesn't change how I feel." He took another step toward me, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, the space between us shrinking by the second. I wanted to back away, to put distance between us, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I stood there, my heart racing. Then, without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. The touch was electric, sending a wave of heat through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat, and I saw the same emotions mirrored in his eyes: confusion, desire, guilt. It was all there, laid bare between us. "I don't want to hurt anyone," James whispered, his thumb gently brushing over the back of my hand. "But I can't pretend like this isn't real." I swallowed hard, my mind spinning with conflicting emotions. I knew he was right. There was something between us, something that felt real and undeniable. But this was wrong, wasn't it? I was his stepmother, and he was Daniel's son. We couldn't do this. I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice barely audible. James stepped closer, his hand tightening around mine. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "But we can't keep pretending like nothing's happening." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. And in that moment, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep pretending. The tension between us had been building for too long, and now that it was out in the open, there was no going back. Before I could say anything else, James leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine. The kiss was tentative, hesitant, as though he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hand finding its way to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss was filled with all the unspoken emotions that had been growing between us: desire, confusion, guilt, and something deeper, something that felt like love. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know where it would lead, but in that moment, I didn't care. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. The reality of what had just happened settled over us, but instead of feeling regret, I felt something else. Relief. Relief that the tension between us had finally broken, that we had stopped pretending. James looked down at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that things between us had changed, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. But as I stood there, holding his hand, I realized something. I didn't want to go back. "This isn't over," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Then, as if to soften their weight, I added, "But we'll figure it out." James smiled, a small, tentative smile, and for the first time since that morning in the bathroom, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, we would face it together. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments, shared glances, and unspoken emotions that lingered between James and me. After that first kiss, we both knew we had crossed a line, but instead of guilt or regret, there was a sense of relief. Like the tension that had been building between us for weeks had finally been released. Yet with that relief came the undeniable realization that our lives would never be the same. David was still away on business, and with him gone, James and I found ourselves alone in the house more often than not. The quiet moments we shared together now carried new meaning. Every touch, every glance, every smile felt loaded with unspoken questions. What did this mean for us? Where was this headed? And most importantly, how long could we keep this a secret? One evening, a few days after that first kiss, James and I sat on the back porch together. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the yard. The air was warm with the remnants of the day's heat. We had fallen into a routine of spending evenings outside, talking about nothing in particular, enjoying each other's company in the kind of silence that only comes when two people feel deeply connected. James was sitting close to me, our knees touching. The warmth of his skin sent familiar shivers through me. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I turned to look at him, he smiled, a soft, tentative smile that made my heart race. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice quiet and hesitant. "Of course," I replied, shifting slightly to face him. He looked down at his hands as if gathering his thoughts. "Have you thought about what this means? I mean, for us?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I had thought about it constantly, but I hadn't wanted to say those thoughts out loud. I hadn't wanted to confront the reality of what was happening between us. James nodded, his eyes still focused on the ground. I don't want you to think this is some kind of, I don't know, phase or something. I care about you, more than I probably should, and I know this is complicated, but I can't stop how I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said. My breath caught in my throat, my heart aching with the truth of what he was saying. I cared about him too, more than I should, but I was terrified of what that meant. For us, for my marriage to Daniel. "I care about you too," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "But it's not just about us. There's Daniel. He's your father, and my husband. If he found out..." James's expression tightened, his jaw clenching as he nodded. "I know. I don't want to hurt him either, but I also don't want to pretend like nothing's happening between us." I bit my lip, struggling to find the right words. Everything about this felt so real, so intense, and yet the consequences loomed large in the back of my mind. I didn't want to hurt Daniel, didn't want to betray him, but the connection I felt with James was undeniable. "I don't know what the right thing is," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "but I know that I can't ignore this anymore." James looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, hope, fear, and desire. Slowly, he reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. The simple touch sent a wave of calm through me, grounding me in the moment. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." I nodded, my heart swelling with the certainty in his words. In that moment, everything felt clearer. The fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, it all faded away, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. We didn't have all the answers, but we didn't need them. What mattered was that we were in this together and that we cared about each other. We sat there in silence for a while, the sun sinking lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. The air was still, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets as the day gave way to night. I leaned my head against James's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. But as much as I wanted to stay in that moment, reality was never far away. Daniel would be coming home in a few days, and the thought of facing him filled me with a sense of dread. How could I look him in the eye, knowing what had happened between James and me? How could I pretend that everything was normal when nothing felt normal anymore? The next few days, James and I tried to act normal. We avoided serious conversations and focused on small talk, but the tension between us never disappeared. Every glance we exchanged carried the weight of what we hadn't said, and I felt the guilt gnawing at me. I knew this wasn't sustainable, but I didn't know what to do. One night, just a day before Daniel was set to return, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts raced, refusing to quiet. The house was silent. The only sound, the soft hum of the air conditioning turning on and off. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to James, to the way he had touched me, kissed me, and made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between my feelings for James and my loyalty to Daniel. But the thought of making that choice, of potentially losing one of them, felt unbearable. As I lay there, lost in my thoughts, I heard a soft knock on the bedroom door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up, my pulse racing. "Charlotte?" James's voice came through the door, quiet but steady. "Come in," I said softly, my voice trembling. The door opened slowly, and James stepped inside, his expression serious. He closed the door behind him and walked over to the bed, sitting down on the edge. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his eyes focused on the floor. "About what you said, about Daniel. And I know this is hard. I don't want to put you in a position where you have to choose." I swallowed hard, my heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "James, I love you, Charlotte," he said suddenly, cutting me off. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I love you. And I know it's not fair to ask you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Deep down, I had always known how he felt, but hearing him say it out loud, admitting the depth of his emotions, made everything feel more real. "I love you too," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. James looked up at me, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. "You do?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I do, but that doesn't make this any easier." There was a moment of silence, and I could see he didn't know what to say. And then suddenly, I made my decision. I pulled back the sheets and looked at him, silently inviting him to join me. Now, when I think back on that moment, I realize I made my decision based on feelings, not logic. But at the time, I didn't care. James immediately understood what I meant and climbed into the bed beside me. I leaned into him and kissed him. It went further than either of us expected, and for the first time, I completely let myself go. It was exciting, overwhelming, and freeing all at once. For a brief moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. But as quickly as it started, it was over. I could imagine how exciting this must have been for him, and I understood. Afterward, he reached out and took my hand in his. For a moment, we just sat there, staring at each other, the weight of the world pressing down on us. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." And in that moment, I believed him. But deep down, I knew I still had a decision to make. And I also knew what the right decision was. The morning Daniel returned home felt like the calm before the storm. The weight of what had been building between James and me hung in the air like a fog neither of us could escape. We both knew that with Daniel back, things would have to change. We weren't just stepmother and stepson anymore. We had crossed into a new realm of complicated emotions. As much as I tried to push it to the back of my mind, it was always there, looming. David's return was marked by his usual warmth, a hug, a kiss on the cheek, and the familiar routine of catching up on the days we had spent apart. He seemed completely unaware of the quiet tension between James and me. His cheerful personality filled the house, creating a sense of normalcy. But beneath that surface, I felt like I was suffocating. Every glance James and I exchanged carried the weight of what we hadn't yet resolved. With Daniel back in the picture, the complexity of our situation felt even heavier. That evening, after dinner, Daniel suggested we all sit in the living room to catch up. I forced a smile, trying to hide the storm brewing inside me, and sat down on the couch. My heart raced as James sat across from me, his eyes flicking toward mine. David talked about his trip and all the work he needed to catch up on. The small talk buzzed around us, but I could barely focus. My mind was elsewhere, stuck in the memories of the moments James and I had shared. Eventually, Daniel excused himself to take a work call, leaving James and me alone in the living room. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, neither of us spoke. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands clenched together as though he was trying to keep himself from reaching out to me. I looked down, the guilt gnawing at me. "We can't keep doing this behind Daniel's back," I said finally, breaking the silence. "It's not fair to him. He doesn't deserve this." James stopped pacing and turned to face me. "What are you saying?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my next words settling heavily in my chest. "I'm saying we need to figure this out. We can't keep living in this limbo." James stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mixture of pain and understanding. "You're right," he said softly. "But what does that mean for us?" I didn't have an answer. The thought of making a decision, choosing between Daniel and James, felt impossible. But I knew that continuing to hide wasn't sustainable. If we didn't do something soon, the truth would come out in a way that would hurt everyone involved. "I don't know yet," I replied honestly, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to be honest with ourselves. Whatever this is between us, we have to figure out what it means." James nodded, though the sadness in his eyes was hard to miss. He walked over and sat beside me on the couch. His hand found mine, and for a moment we sat there in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. His touch was warm, comforting. I found myself leaning into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "I wish things were different," he whispered. "So do I," I replied softly. "But we can't pretend forever." We stayed like that for a while, sitting together in the quiet of the living room. Daniel's voice, faint and muffled, drifted in from the next room as he continued his call. It felt like the calm before the inevitable storm. I knew that sooner or later, we would have to face it. The next morning, as Daniel left for work, I found myself standing in the kitchen with James. The silence between us was filled with all the things we hadn't said. I could feel the tension building, the need to talk, to decide what came next, but the words wouldn't come. "I think we need to talk," I finally said, breaking the silence. James nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it too." We sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of our conversation pressing down on both of us. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts, but it was difficult. Everything about this felt so overwhelming, so tangled. "I love Daniel," I started, my voice shaking, "but I can't ignore what's been happening between us. I care about you, James, a lot, and I don't know how to reconcile that with my marriage to your father." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't want to hurt him either, Charlotte, but I don't want to lose you." His words hit me hard, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to lose him either, but the reality of our situation was undeniable. We couldn't keep going like this without everything falling apart. "I think we need to take some time," I said slowly, my voice trembling. "We need to figure out what this is without rushing into anything, and maybe that means stepping back for a while." James's face fell, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "Stepping back?" he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, my heart aching. "I think it's the only way we can figure this out. We need to be sure about what we're feeling, and we can't do that while hiding everything from Daniel." James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. I could see the conflict in his expression, the same conflict I felt deep inside. Finally, he sighed, nodding slowly. "Okay," he said softly. "If that's what you think is best." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "I don't want to lose you, James, but we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I don't want to lose you either, Charlotte, but if this is what we need to do, then I'll do it." The conversation left me feeling drained, but also relieved. We weren't pretending anymore. We were acknowledging the truth of what was happening between us, and that was the first step toward figuring out what came next. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. In the days that followed, James and I kept our distance, trying to give ourselves the space we needed to think. It was difficult, painful even, but it was necessary. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that whatever happened, we would face it together. Eventually, we would have to make a decision. But for now, we were taking it one day at a time, navigating the complicated emotions that had brought us to this point. And no matter what happened, I knew that the bond between us, the connection we shared, would remain, even if it had to change. That night, as I lay in bed, the house quiet around me, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for now, that was enough.
Charlotte, after everything you've shared, there's one thing we're all dying to know. If you could go back to that morning, to that quiet house, knowing how everything would unfold, would you make the same choice, or would you walk away?
That's a question I ask myself every day. Part of me wishes I could say I'd walk away, that I'd choose the safer path. But the truth is, I'm not sure I would. That morning wasn't just the start of something forbidden. It was the moment I truly felt alive. And sometimes, feeling alive is worth everything, even the cost. I appreciate the invitation and this space to share my story.
No problem. Thank you for saying yes, Charlotte. And we want to tell all our listeners to send in their stories